All right, good evening. This is the group we have tonight. I got a call and texts from a few people who weren't going to make it for various reasons, but this will be good. I'm excited about tonight. We got the Tower of Babel tonight, and this is a pretty interesting story, pretty cool lesson. We have some interesting history, archaeology stuff to throw in with it, and it should be good. Why don't we open up in prayer and we can get started. Lord, we thank you for this day that you've given us. We thank you for the group that was able to make it out tonight. We just pray that you'd be with us during this time as we study your word. I pray you would help us to understand what is written there and what it means and what you have for us in it, what we can learn about you. We just thank you for this time. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. All right, we'll be starting in Genesis chapter 10. But my question first, do you have any unfinished projects around your house? Sure. Yeah, you don't have to keep up with your house, yeah. Yeah. You got a few lawnmowers? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you know what my kryptonite is? Whenever a job is like 75% or more done is when I typically give up on it for a while. Yeah. Yeah, it's like... Yeah, it's tough when, if something's broken and it's like, oh no, the front door is off the hinges. Like, you're going to get it back on the hinges no matter what. It's when it's like mostly functional that you're like, it basically works. It's fine. There's that kind of stuff. But tonight we are going to talk about a massive unfinished building project, hence my flawless segue. So Genesis chapter 10 is a genealogy, so we're not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to set us up a little bit. So if you remember, of course, last week we talked about the flood, but so what we've covered so far in Genesis is two major rebellions so far. So we've had the fall in the garden, and then you have... Again, whatever view you take on it, the Genesis 6 event, sons of God, daughters of men, which immediately leads into the flood. So you have the initial fall rebellion, the flood rebellion, I guess you could say, and tonight the Tower of Babel consists of the third in a rebellion motif that goes on in chapters 1 through 11 of Genesis. So it kind of is finishing up the primeval history that we have here and is going to launch us into basically the plot line of the entire rest of the Bible. So we finished last week. We had a brief, odd story about Noah and his sons after they got off the ark. His sons were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. So if we're in chapter 10, just look at verse 1. Just to set you up for this. Now these are the generations of the sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and unto them were born sons after the flood. Verse 5. By these, all these people, were the isles of the Gentiles divided in their lands, every one after his tongue, after their families, in their nations. Now I'm just going to stop right there. What is our logical problem with verse 5? Yeah. Verse 5, they're already classified as nations and tongues. So, typically, Genesis 10 is just referred to as the table of nations. And what Moses seemed to have been doing is, again, like we've pointed out in some other biblical stories, they weren't as concerned with chronology as the story. Like, obviously Moses is very concerned with chronology as he does the genealogies, but he put this table here, and he's going to explain how he got there in chapter 11, and then he saves some extra genealogical information for the end of chapter 11 to roll into the next story. So he kind of split it up thematically a little bit, if that makes sense. Just to throw that out there, might be something you would catch if you ever decided to like read through the Genesis 10 genealogy. Instead of reading the genealogies, let's look in your book, page 36. They do a nice recap. All right. Page 36, there's a paragraph that starts with, Japheth had 7 sons and 7 grandsons. They settled mainly in the north in modern Turkey, as well as west and south of the Caspian Sea. Madai, a son of Japheth, is the one from whom the Medes descended. They settled in what we now call Persia. The Greeks are descendants of the sons of Javan. Hellenists is a term to describe Greeks, is probably from the name Elisha, one of Javan's sons. Historically, the descendants of Japheth did not cross paths with the nation of Israel, but they are mentioned in prophecy. And then Ham had 4 sons. Cush, the oldest, had descendants who settled in southern Arabia. The queen of Sheba, who visited King Solomon, was a descendant of Cush. All right, so those are the basics you need to know. I mean, it's not really relevant to the story per se, but important nations that spring from Japheth. We're going to look at the primary important descendant from Ham, and then Shem is going to come later in our series of events. That's who Moses puts later in chapter 11. Okay, back to the text. We remember Ham was cursed. That was the son that Noah cursed, and a descendant of Ham lives up to it. All right, chapter 10, verse 8, in the line of Ham. And Cush begot Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Wherefore it is said, even as Nimrod, the mighty hunter before the Lord. And the beginning of his kingdom was Babel, and Erech, and Akkad, and Calneh in the land of Shinar. Out of that land went forth Asher, and builded Nineveh, and the city of Rehoboth, and Calah, and Rezin between Nineveh and Calah. The same is a great city. All right, that's what we get about Nimrod, technically. Based on what we read, what do you think of him? Maybe you know some things off before coming to this. Some people are just thinking of Bugs Bunny. So, to answer the sillier question, Bugs Bunny calling Elmer Fudd Nimrod, most people don't realize it, but it was a joke. Like when he first said it, so Nimrod, if you know, he's a mighty hunter, and then you have Elmer Fudd walking around being completely a complete buffoon, and he calls him Nimrod. Like if someone, take any other thing and, someone is a terrible archer, and you're like, hey, Robin Hood, how's it going? Same idea. But Bugs Bunny was so popular that people just started using it as a term for like someone inept. Okay, so Nimrod. So he's from the line of Ham, and that should clue us in just right off the bat. We should be concerned with things coming from the line of Ham in this series of events. So his name would translate to something roughly like, let us rebel, or something of that nature. So when it says he, in verse 8, he began to be a mighty one in the earth. Now that sounds good, and it can be good. David had mighty men, and that was a good thing. However, it's the exact same word we get in Genesis 6:4 when they're talking about like the Nephilim who became mighty men of renown, that whole thing. So the term in Hebrew, mighty men, can mean warrior or tyrant. Like there's a wide range of meaning there. And again, when you were saying, before the Lord, like what does that mean? It's another word with a wide range of meaning, to where a lot of people, like some translations will just straight up do like against the Lord. So before, like in an adversarial sense, which kind of can get lost in our modern thinking. But yeah, when something more adversarial. And we see that in verse 10, the beginning of his kingdom. So he was an industrious fellow. We can give him that. Verse 10, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. And of course, we'll talk all about that. The end of that verse, it's in the land of Shinar, which should sound familiar to you. And he also builds, verse 11, Nineveh, or begins to build Nineveh. So Nineveh is the capital of what? Assyria. One of the biggest enemies of the Israelites at a later stage. The plains of Shinar. What else was by the plains of Shinar? Do we remember that? Yeah, we haven't covered it yet, but it should sound familiar. No, it was not that. No, it was Sodom and Gomorrah are on the plains of Shinar. And then, of course, we'll talk about Babel. Yeah, so, and the reason I'm pointing out Nimrod, one, the text points out Nimrod, like in what is otherwise a list of names and fathers and sons. It takes time to dig into who this guy is. And when you consider the beginning of his kingdom is Babel, next chapter as we get to the Tower of Babel, he's not named because that's not how the story's set up, but you can make pretty good assumptions. Oh, this is his place, So this tyrant, ruler, mighty man against God, that's who's starting all of this. Well, I mean, all those big cities, and these cities end up being very important to Israelite history. So, he's not a character you think about, but the fruit of his labor ends up being pretty devastating to Israel down the line. Okay, so we're going to jump to chapter 11 and read verses 1 through 9. You've probably heard the story, but I'll still just get your initial thoughts on it. Genesis 11. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven. Let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. The Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. The Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. I assume we've heard this before in some fashion. What are your opening thoughts? What strikes you about it? Oh, the app? Yeah. Oh, well, I'm pretty sure they did that on purpose. Yeah. Yeah, it would have been quite a shock. Have you guys seen like the memes that go around with it, where it'll be like a picture of a guy and saying like, "Hey, let's build the tower to heaven, and then let's do this and let's do that," and then like the last bubble is like Chinese lettering or something like that because switch the language. It's funnier if you see it. Yeah, you'd have to do some chronology work, which I'm sure people have done. Yeah, well, and like also, so keep in mind that so again, Moses is writing this long after it happens. So if you read the Table of Nations in chapter 10, knowing that chapter 11 kind of comes like probably partway through that, I don't know what point I was making. But basically, okay, so like he's reader digesting some of it. Also, like you'll notice it's only, for the most part, it's only like the firstborn sons that are mentioned. So especially, we'll actually talk about the lifespans again a little bit tonight. And there's so much time for people to make people. My point was the Gentiles splitting off to their isles and the languages. That's obviously after the events of the Tower of Babel, so there's even like a little more time for that to happen. Right. Well, and it's funny, he's using the word Gentiles already, which means nations, non-Jewish nations. So he's writing from the vantage point of like Israel's already formed as a people after the Exodus. When they do use isles, like you'll find this in the prophets a lot, where they'll talk about the isles, and it's unclear whether they're being completely literal or it's just like, because Jerusalem's the center of the world, like we're the important place in God's plan, and then you have like the Gentiles scattered around them, and it can kind of be used symbolically sometimes. I don't know exactly what Moses is doing, but either way, you got the same idea of groups of Gentiles. Anything else with this text that jumps out at you? Well, and I think especially because, God's big concern before and after the flood is the imaginations of the heart of man. So, I don't know that his main concern was like, oh, they're building brick structures. They're going to be in space in no time, Like it's not like, oh, rocket ships. Now that they're all talking one language, it's yeah, they left off that. Yeah. Okay, so a few things from the text. So of course we start off the chapter, they're all speaking one language, which makes perfect sense after the story of Noah, even giving it few hundred years, however long, it's probably longer than that, actually. But yeah, they're still all coming from one source, one language, so that makes sense. The reason I spent so much time with Nimrod is so the simple word they in verse 2 makes sense. We don't know exactly who's with him. We don't know that it's necessarily, this event is Nimrod leading a group of people, but we know his empire starts at Babel, and some large group of people all journeyed together to this plain. And like I said, they're in the land of Shinar, and biblically just always be suspicious of Shinar. Like because of how this just keeps evolving throughout Scripture, like, you're going to have the Tower of Babel, you're going to have Sodom and Gomorrah, and like, especially in the book of Genesis, just that should raise a red flag for us. So verse 3, they're using the incredible technology of brick and slime. Now, that's a funny phrase to us. Also, like, it says they're using brick for stone. Like, okay, what's happening here? So this region, they didn't actually have tons of stone, like massive things of limestone that you can carve out. So at some point they have this technology they have a lot of clay and earth, and they can basically, make like clay bricks. The slime would be actually like ancient asphalt and bitumen. I don't know what that is, but yeah, that was the gist I got. Like resin. Okay. Yeah, I didn't realize asphalt is as old of a substance as it is. Like, that goes way back. I'm sure it's not exactly like our stuff today, but ancient civilizations were using that for different things. That was part of Rome's concrete formula that they had, like, that we lost for like 1,000 years after the empire fell. So the bricks and slime, literally what's happening is clay bricks and asphalt. Spiritually, and I think you'll understand what I mean by this, because Moses is writing both Genesis and Exodus. There's only one other time that these bricks and slime come up again, and it is Exodus 1:14, when they're describing the bondage that Israel is under in Egypt, being forced into labor. So if you've already seen this rebellion story and like what it means and how it plays out into the human storyline, by the time you get to Exodus and you go, oh, they're under bondage of, being forced to work with brick and slime, you go, oh, I see what's happening here. Like, Pharaoh is a bigger Babel. Like, that's what's happening with Egypt in a thematic sense. Okay, so verse 4. Just tell me, what do you think they're trying to do? What do you think they're doing with the tower? Like, literally, if you had to put it into words, what's their thought process in your mind? Another flood, that's an interesting thought. Right. Yeah, these are all good. So, in the Sunday school version of it, I remember being taught, like, they were trying to reach heaven without God. And, when you're talking to kids, you're kind of literally making it seem like they thought, man, if I can just build a tower high enough, I can literally get to heaven. And then you become an adult and you're like, ancient people weren't stupid. This isn't, like, that's not what's happening. It's not just a very skewed understanding of how the universe functions. So, so they're building a city. The tower is what we mostly focus on and what we will continue to focus on tonight. And they're trying to build a name, and lest they be scattered. So we know they're supposed to be spreading throughout the earth, like we said. So their intent is rebellion for the glory of their own name. Now, the tower, it's not just a tall tower to reach God. It is much worse. And we're going to dig into this in a little bit of detail. So if you have a picture of a tower in your mind, are you thinking like what? Okay, that's a very different tower, the Eiffel Tower. So when you hear like, they built a tower, you probably think of like a medieval castle's like spire. There's probably going to be some archers at the top, and not that kind of tower, not like a Rapunzel kind of tower. So most scholars believe it would have been a ziggurat. Now, do we know what a ziggurat is? Okay, some yes, some no. Yeah. Okay, so I drew a terrible little picture of it. Just ignore the writing on the top. We'll get to it. Just so you see what we're working with. Terrible little picture. Okay, you can find actual recreations of this online. I'll link some stuff. It's fascinating. Think of a pyramid, that's more box-shaped. So think of more like, if you can think of a Mayan pyramid, okay, something like that. But what it had was the little scratch things going like that. Those are steps. There are steps going up the center. It had, this is being based off of a real specific ziggurat, terrible as it is. And there were steps like going up to every level. It was 7 levels high, and it was a cultic site. It was a site for specific worship. So I think in order to properly understand what we're doing with the Tower of Babel, we need to think about the nature of pagan worship in Mesopotamia. Okay, so you remember one of the things that Israel used to get into trouble with was high places, okay? So they would have shrines and stuff on the tops of mountains and hills, and they would have sacred trees and this and that. So the idea there is, okay, we're closer to the domain of the gods. We're closer to heaven. These are sacred places, and they would do all sorts of sacrifice, divination, whatever they needed to do. And it's interesting because, again, if you simplify it, you could go like, oh, okay, you're closer to the sky, big deal. Like, that doesn't have an effect. It's sort of based on a spiritual reality that shows up in the Bible. So now we didn't get this from Genesis, but Ezekiel talks about Eden as being a mountain garden. Sinai, Moses meets with God on a mountain. Jerusalem, perhaps the most important mountain in the story, the temple of God is on a mountain. So I guess it would be like spiritual symbolism that's going on there that God seems to work within with his people in these situations. The pagans are copying this idea. And so like that, those are what they use high places for. And then when you think about pyramids, they're artificial high places. They're artificial holy mountains that they build in certain locations. So as far as their religious practices go, that's what they're thinking. Okay, no, that wasn't based on a verse. That's why it was confusing me. The high places of all kinds are trying to connect heaven and earth. That's what's happening there. And it's like Babel is an example of this, and it's recreating the sin of the garden, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Like, oh, you'll become like gods. It's that same grasping after divinity. That's what's happening. And we'll get into exactly why that is, because you might be thinking, that is an awful lot to get from the word tower, but we have really good reason for this, and we'll dig into that. All right. In your book, real quick, on page 40, we're going to jump around a little bit. All right, page 40, there's a paragraph that starts with, "The builders of Babel went blithely on their way as though God were distant, too disinterested or too deficient in power to intervene. But God came down to look at the tower," in verse 5. "The irony is obvious. The people elevated themselves, shooting their tower of rebellion into the sky, but the tower was so low that God had to come down to see it." Of course, God knows what's up. It's another condescension moment, like when he says, "Hey, Adam, where are you?" Or, "Hey, Cain, where's your brother?" And it's like they're building this great tower to their own glory, and let's go down and see what the humans are up to, see what they're doing. And then, of course, God confounds the languages, which, yes, must have been quite a shock. And the project is left incomplete. So verse 9 is where you actually get the phrase, like, therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did confound the language of the earth. So we knew Nimrod's kingdom began at Babel. This is the first time in the story we actually get this thing, this tower, referred to as Babel. So the question is, like, okay, where are we? So, like, Plains of Shinar, what does this location even mean? So I'm going to propose something that is very common in the academic literature, not out in left field by any stretch. I'll tell you right off the bat, some Christians have issue with it, and I think that's based on bad arguments that earlier skeptics have made. Okay, so we'll just let this play out. I don't think there's anything out of the realm of normalcy here. So the word in Hebrew for Babel is Babel. It's like extremely similar to our English word. It is used 262 times in the Hebrew text. 260 times it is translated as Babylon. Twice it is translated as Babel. Here and in chapter 10 when it mentions where Nimrod begins his kingdom. You might think, wow, that seems like why didn't they just do Babylon here? Because the King James and every English has followed suit. They were being very clever. So in Hebrew, the word Babel sounds like babbling, like the word Babel does. Like Babel is one of those words that it's kind of a nonsense word, and it means like nonsense speech. It sounds silly. And the King James even though the formal name of the kingdom that will come is Babylon, they kept the Hebrew idiom because it was a place of confusion. Okay, so they're keeping the Hebrew wordplay there. And then we tend to miss that what's the location being referred to is what will later be Babylon. So the reason I think some Christians have issue with this is, like I said, because of bad skepticism. So in 1917, an archaeologist discovered a stele, like it's a big hunk of carved stone. Had all sorts of official court things on it. So it had a picture, which is where this actually comes from, of this tower, and a drawing of Nebuchadnezzar and an inscription, probably not by his hand, but an inscription from Nebuchadnezzar. The ziggurat that this drawing is based off of, loosely, is called Etemenake. Okay, so what was written from Nebuchadnezzar's time? It says, the Etemenake ziggurat, the ziggurat of Babylon, I made it, the wonder of the people of the world. I raised its top to heaven, made doors for the gates, and I covered it with bitumen and bricks. And they go, so the skeptic first once this discovery is made, they go, oh, I see what happened. The Judeans were in Babylon during the exile when Nebuchadnezzar was in charge. They saw this big tower, and this inspired the story. And if you're really skeptical and you don't think much beyond that, you can go like, oh, okay, I see why a quick skeptical look would say that. And then I see why Christians would be like, you know what? No, this is Babel, not Babylon. I don't care what the Hebrew says. This has nothing to do with that. There's been more archaeological research, as always takes place, and I love it for that. So it's pretty interesting. So there was a ziggurat, a great ziggurat in Babylon, and Nebuchadnezzar had something to do with, I would say, polishing it up, is what it seems from the historical record. It's pretty, well, so one, I just want you to notice, even just the language he used that has clearly, and we'll see from what I'm about to read you, he raised its top to heaven, and he's talking about the exact same, brick and bitumen that that the Bible talks about. So he's in line with something, but it's very interesting that he didn't build it, and that's really important. And that's not the right page. This is kind of long. It's not crazy long, but there's a much cooler piece of archaeology that came out. So, like I said, those steles are they would be more like small monuments, like a big piece of rock that's carved out, and then they inscribe stuff on it. They found, so we know where this ziggurat, the ruins still exist. They're very ruinous. It's not like you're seeing a whole lot. They dug down at the four corners, and they found cylinder seals, which is like, when you make a new building, I think we have it on the church. Do we have a time capsule in the capstone? Yeah, so you have a capstone and you put a time capsule in, maybe with a message for the future generations. They did the exact same thing back then. So the king before Nebuchadnezzar, his name was Nabopolassar. He's also in the Bible. There were cylinder seals underneath the four corners of the ziggurat from his day. And he wrote this long thing, and it's eloquent and seems ridiculous at times, but it's interesting. You'll see he thanks his gods a lot in an awkward way that he's really just telling you how awesome he is, and we'll see that. But there's really important information in what they found there. So from Nabopolassar. At that time, I'll try to point out when there are Babylonian deities named. So at that time, my lord Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonians, told me in regard to this ziggurat, which before my day was already very weak and badly buckled, to ground the bottom of the netherworld. He told me to make its tops vie with the heavens. So I fashioned mattocks, spades, brick molds from ivory, ebony, and wood, and I set them in the hands of a vast workforce levied from my hand. I had them shape mud bricks without number and mold-baked bricks like countless raindrops. I had the river Aratu bear asphalt and bitumen like a mighty flood. Through the sagacity of Ea, a deity, through the intelligence of Marduk, that god again, through the wisdom of Nabu and Nisaba, other gods, by means of the vast mind that the God who created me let me possess, I deliberated with my great intellect. I commissioned the wisest experts, and the surveyor established the dimensions with the 12-cubit rule. The master builders drew taut and measuring cords. They determined the limits. I sought the confirmation by consulting Samas, Adad, and Marduk, other gods. And whenever my mind deliberated, and I pondered, unsure of the dimensions, the great gods made the truth known to me by the procedure of oracular confirmation, divination. Through the craft of exorcism, the wisdom of Ea and Marduk, I purified that place and made firm its foundation platform on its ancient base. In its foundations, I laid out gold, silver, gemstones from mountain and sea. Under the brickwork, I set heaps of shining sapsu, which is a sweet scented oil, aromatics, and red earth. I fashioned representations of my royal likeness, bearing a soil basket, and positioned them. A lot going on here. He brings his sons into the process. They're doing some work. And he ends it with, for Marduk, my lord, I made it an object fitting for wonder, just as it was in former times. I know that was long. Hopefully you found it as interesting as I did. So it does seem like Nebuchadnezzar did something. He took credit for doing something. But the guy before him was like, okay, this great and ancient tower is in disrepair, and the gods have told me to raise it back up. So this thing's been around for a very long time. So, like, even before this Babylonian king got to it. So I have absolutely no issue with, okay, it's in Babylon, somewhere here in the plains of Shinar, and again, as far as I'm concerned, it's this one. Like, it seems to be that one. You can look it up online. It's like, we know where it is. I have no problem with the idea that it had been abandoned here. It could have been completed later by other wicked kings, I don't know. But whenever Nabopolassar gets to it, it's in a state of disrepair, and he claims the gods told him to raise it up and restore it to its former glory. And then Nebuchadnezzar slaps a coat of paint on it or something. But there's a few interesting things in there that, like, so one, you noticed he said that, you know, his gods told him to do it, and anytime he ran into trouble, he would use, like, divination and prophets and seek counsel from his gods to continue this. So I don't know what you think about foreign gods. Paul lets us know, like, that when Israel sacrificed to false gods in the wilderness, they're sacrificing to devils. You know, we tend to think, oh, so, you know, we're monotheists. That means there are no other, there's no other God, like the uncreated one worthy of worship. But there are other spiritual beings that have power, and that is the biblical stance on what pagans are worshiping, and all you have to do is look at the fruit of their worship, and that seems very obvious. So, you know, you can say people are making things up. I take him at his word and think, like, oh, if he's even remotely telling the truth, dark spiritual forces had this thing constructed, like, again. It's a weird take, but like, that's, I take the paganism of the ancient world seriously. I tend to think they're not just making things up. So, like, it's a demonic structure, like, through and through. It seems to be commanded by dark forces, and even when he gets stumped, he goes back to them. And the temple to Marduk would be right across the way from this. Which also kind of makes you think about, we were just talking about the statue that Nebuchadnezzar built. You know, he builds a giant statue and commands worship of it. And it's like, oh yeah, because he had part in this giant ziggurat that he helped refurbish in Babylon. And yeah, there was a big temple to their chief deity right across the street. And yeah, that's probably what was going on. Oh yeah, that's not the last time it comes up in history. You know, Nebuchadnezzar's not the last time. So Alexander the Great, as he marches through Persia, he conquers the territory that formerly was Persia, Babylon before that. And the tower is there in disrepair. I can only imagine, I don't know if it fell into disrepair again. I would imagine when the Persian armies swept through Babylon that it was destroyed in some fashion then. Alexander the Great thought this was super cool. He's like, hey, you guys need to start rebuilding this, and he commissioned it to be restored. He came back a little under a decade later, and like nothing was done. And he was like, all right, tear it down, we're going to build it from the ground up. So they tore it down, mostly, and then he died. So it's just a heap of ruins now. There's not a ton left. But so like it comes up in like different historians' writings closer to the Greek period, and yeah, it's all over the place. So quickly, we should. Okay, let's look at the whiteboard again. I don't know how well you can see this. Like, can you see the writing? Okay, no, not if you're at the end of the table. So, I've been telling you about chiasms the whole time, since we started, like, a form of literature that is employed. I didn't have time to go over it with the flood, because that's just too big of a chiasm. This is what we're talking about, this, like, arrow shape. So, the story starts off with the whole earth being one language. It ends with the whole earth scattered. And it's a poetic form that uses key words within the text and usually has a play on what was happening the first time, to where, like, so this A, whole earth one language, matches whole earth scattered. Second thing is, the whole earth was one language. They were dwelling, that they move and they dwell in that plain of Shinar. By the end, they're scattering by that corresponding B. C, they have plans to, they're telling their plans to one another. At the end, they can't understand one another. So, like, you'd have to compare it with the text, because they, you think, like, okay, why am I saying one another? Because they use, like, these key phrases with funny things happening. The phrase go to, they're going to go to make bricks. Down here it's go to, let us go down. It's God speaking. So you have these parallel events that usually kind of flip on each other, and they have a hinge point in the story. One thing that has no parallel that changes the flow to start in the opposite direction. And in this case, which is usually what it is, something with the Lord comes down. So if you're interested, take a look at this. I'll try to put something up on the website. But yeah, it's interesting. It's Hebrew poetry, and it doesn't make a lot of sense to us a lot of the time. And for what it's worth, I would probably not catch it if I didn't do research. Like, much smarter Hebrew Semitic scholars have spent lifetimes working on Hebrew poetic form. So there's that. We have about 5 minutes. I will just let you know, instead of making a big deal out of it, after the flood, lifespans start going down. The rest of Genesis 11 is a genealogy, so it's a further continuation of the line of Shem. So, yeah, we said after the flood, lifespans start going down. After the Tower of Babel, lifespans go down even more. So someone we didn't mention in Genesis 10 was a guy named Peleg. It says he was around, his name means division, because he was born around the time that the earth was divided. So they believe it's talking about the events at Babel when all the nations are scattered. So that kind of gives us a time for when this happened. But, so for example, Noah lived 950 years. Long time. Immediately after the flood, Shem, this good line that we're following, Shem only lived 600 years, but still pretty good. His son lives 438 years, 433 years, 464 years. Then Peleg, and we assume Babel happens. Peleg only lives 239 years. His son is 239, 230. His son is 148. We bump back up to 205, and then, so I don't know exactly. It's another rebellion thing, I guess. These are the big rebellions in primeval history. Apparently we were supposed to live forever, and then after the first rebellion, you have a lifespan. After the flood, shorter lifespans. After Babel, shorter lifespans. And we will end with chapter 11, we're going to look at verse 27 through the end of the chapter. Again, this follows the line of Shem, one of Noah's sons. Eventually, we come to a person named Terah in the line of Shem. Now, these are the generations of Terah. Terah begot Abram, Nahor, and Haran begot Lot. And Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his nativity, in Ur of the Chaldees. And Abram and Nahor took them wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, the father of Iscah. But Sarai was barren, she had no child. And Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his son's son, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth with them from Ur of the Chaldees to go into the land of Canaan. They came unto Haran and dwelt there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Probably not, but any thoughts on that? So, and again, this is why when composing this book, you had the table of nations, even though there are no nations yet. So then he tells the story of Babel, because he's still giving you all that genetic information, tells the story of Babel so he can finish up and extend Shem's line to get us to Abram, who is going to be Abraham, the patriarch of Israel. So, because next week we'll just jump right into the story of Abram, I'll say this now. When you consider what has happened since creation, you have, Adam is supposed to be doing the human thing, fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, all that. He falls, and then, we get to extreme wickedness to where God has to destroy the earth, save just Noah, this, righteous man, and his children. After the flood, Noah falls. And then we get this final, whole human scale rebellion against God at Babel. Because you got to think, at that point, they're all just people. There's no Jew, Gentile, there's nothing like that. And then as we are waiting for the promise of the snake crusher, the one who will crush the head of the serpent, you have Babel. And he just okay, you know what? We're done for now. You guys go speak a different language, scatter. And then it follows up with one guy. And we're going to start, the hope of kind of getting back to Eden, in a sense. We were dealing with every human, that they were kind of all the in crowd. Now we're pushing these nations away for a minute, and we're going to work through this one guy. And you're going to see the entire history of Israel come out from okay, this is now how God is going to do what he promised in Genesis 3:15. This is how he's going to fix the curse of sin and death and restore the initial good heaven and earth creation. So this really just sets the stage for the entire rest of the Bible. So very interesting. Another story of rebellion against God, pride, seeking divinity without God. And in this case, it's writ large. So that's what we have for tonight. Tower of Babel. Anything we need to discuss before we're done? Right. Well, and if you're building a city, that's those plains are good. There's a reason they all built cities there. They just happen to be wicked, it's a good place to be. Yeah. All right. Why don't we pray? We can close up this was week 10. Week 10. We're almost done. All right. Lord, thank you for this night. Thank you for your word. Pray we would continue to meditate on it even further, that we would just see more of the truth that you have for us, and especially how it could relate and just help us to understand our own sin and how we should be seeking you, not seeking to glorify ourselves. Lord, we just thank you for your word. We thank you for this time together. Pray you'd bring us back safely next week. In your name, Jesus, I pray. Amen. All right.